Welcome and greetings. My name is Peter, and in today's tutorial we're going to build a different storyteller that gets triggered by a webhook, and we're going to start from scratch because it's good practice. We could modify this workflow, but again I'm going to rewrite it from scratch. So we're going to start with a new flow, and we're going to call it storyteller advanced. And in this iteration of the storyteller, what we're going to be doing is, in the original version, we just triggered it on a time basis, once a day at 6 p.m. But it wasn't very programmable because we couldn't change any of the parameters. But in this one, we're going to. So let's see how this might work. So the first thing is, let's start from the top and let's select a different trigger. So we're going to use a webhook, and so we're going to select that. And let's give it a name. And in the configuration section here, you'll see there's a few interesting things that we haven't seen before. So the first thing is the webhook address itself. So this is the endpoint that you can send your HTTP request to fire this workflow, essentially. So in this case, if you were to webhook this address with a get or a put or a post or a patch or head or options, any one of the HTTP request methods, then this workflow will start running. And this button here allows you to copy the address, and this allows you to refresh it. So refreshing it will just create a different prefix here. And the warning, or the caveat here, is that just bear in mind that if you do refresh this and change it to something else, then that's fine. However, if you've got things connected to your webhook, then they're not going to be able to communicate with it anymore. So again, you can play with this as much as you like. It's basically a base 64 string. The second thing to note is that in this block, we need to provide a test event. And this is because we essentially want to simulate calls to this endpoint in a replayable way. And to do that, we can simulate what we might get in a webhook event, and then these variables, while we're testing, will get passed downstream as the event that hypothetically triggered the workflow, so only while we're testing. So let's fill in some of these variables here. So we're going to be using post as our method, and we're not going to be passing parameters on as part of the URL. So we could put a question mark on the end here and then pass x equals y ampersand, z equals q, and then those variables would appear in the query under the query key here. We're going to be doing stuff with the body. So I don't need to bore you with me keying a bunch of stuff in. So I've got a bunch of variables that I think would be useful in our application. So again, we're doing a storyteller, and so the prompt, we're probably going to need a prompt. So that's programmable. Create a 50-word children's story about an octopus explorer in this case. And again, once we have the webhook and everything wired up correctly, we're going to be able to send this as part of the webhook. So that might be a postman request or a curl request or a request from the back end of your computer system or wherever. So we've got a rate, which we'll use for the speech rate, a voice, which is the Google text-to-speech. It's one of the voices that they have. I think it's a female American accent voice, but we can find that out. The encoding, we want our audio book to be in MP3 format, and our image, we're also going to prompt for that as well, so that we can vary that in addition to the prompt that we're actually using for the to generate the story, and then perhaps an email address that we want to actually send the package to. So I'm going to set up the next block, which will be to let's set up a Node.js block so we can play a little bit. So for now, let's have a look at what we get. So when any workflow runs, we get passed in our any code blocks, we get passed the context of the run, and that's passed in as a $sign in the JavaScript or the Node.js block. So we could actually return that so that we can explore a little bit. So we'll return an object we'll call it context, and we'll just return the dollar variable, and let's see what we get in our run context variable here. So if we run this, so we can run all blocks, and then we'll take a look at the results that appear here. So we've gone ahead and run it, and then, ooh, look at this. So the first thing I notice is that we forgot to give this a name, so let's give this a name, node.js. So the parameters all appear under the block name, and then it was called that, untitled. And then we returned the context, which has a flow ID and has a bunch of stuff on it in terms of the context here. Now, the piece that we're interested in is the trigger, the thing that triggered this workflow to start running. And I need to be in the results, sorry. And so in the trigger here, if we drop that down, you'll notice that there's an event. And then the event is a webhook, which is what we're using. The fired at time, the endpoint that was called, the method, which was post. So this method query body headers is all the mock data that we are basically using. So anyway, to get to this variable, we're going to be using, given that it's on dollar on the context here, we want $trigger and then event prompt, $trigger event prompt. So let's add a ChatGPT block as our next block, as our story creator block. So we are going to add the chat completion. So chat completion, and let's configure it we need to configure this with our connector, and then we need to go ahead and grab a model that we're going to use, and we are going to use the 0301 turbo model. But our prompt this time, we're going to use an expression. Instead of just keying in, write me a story about, we can do it differently. So we're going to use the variable from the webhook. So we click on the expression button here. That turns this field into an expression. And again, to get out of it, you would just backspace twice to get rid of the content, and it'll be back to a text field. But we want it to be this. And so we want the variable $trigger.event.body, which is the body of the webhook, and then prompt. And everything else is optional. So we should be able to test from the start of the workflow to here. And we are going to get a 50-word children's story about an octopus explorer, hopefully. So let's test it from top to bottom. So we'll test all blocks. Now, ChatGPT is fairly busy at this time of day, and so we can get bumped. We could get an error back. We didn't, which is great. And so we got our story. So we're actually passing in a parameter now. We're not keying in text. So where can we take this? Well, we can take this here, and we can use it for our next block, which, remember, we're going to create our audio. Okay, so we're going to use a Google text-to-speech block. Sorry if I went a little bit quickly there, but I grabbed a Google text-to-speech operation block. So we'll just call this TTS for text-to-speech. And here, let's go with the Google. We need to connect it. So this is our authorization. We set this up in a previous lecture. And then the text we're going to give it is going to be from the output of the previous block. But the one thing that we can use is our voice. So instead of using one of these canned voices here, we can make it programmatic by pressing the expression button. And here, instead of prompt, I think we call it voice. Let's have a look. So let's go back to the top. So we've got voice as the variable, the parameter, and we've got encoding. So we've got rate, voice, and encoding that we're going to be using with the Google text-to-speech block. So we've got rate. We're down here again. So we've got this again, we can cut and paste. So the speaking rate, we can turn that also into a programmable field. And so that's going to be rate. And then we haven't programmed any of the pitches. We could raise them or lower them. And I think we did the encoding. So we could change the encoding. So we're going to make this into an expression. And then we're going to change this to be encoding. Okay, perfect. So this means that out of the webhook itself, the parameters that we're going to post, we're actually programming our blocks to do various things. We will send the file to temp audio mp3, which is fine. I'm going to go to the top and save this. And so let's continue. The next block, I think we also do need to continue, go back and get the text that came out of the previous block. So this text, we need the path to this variable. So that's going to be $block chat completion, which, so I've spelt this wrong. So we want to make this something like that. So if I run everything from, let's see, where do we want to run this from? Here. So start to here. So we'll get a new story and we'll get the results. Then we can take the text out of this open AI block. So in our results here, we've got this story. This is the text we want to cut and paste. We don't want to cut and paste. We want to cut and paste the position so that as the story changes. But that's going to be our text, which is going to go in here. And we only need one bracket. So that's going to be the return from the chat completion block. So that's going to be our text. And then it's going to dump the audio into this file here. So the next thing we did was we generated an image to go with it. So let's use chat. Let's do the OpenAI create image here, and let's configure that. So this is the next block, OpenAI. And our prompt is going to be our image prompt. So we're going to want to turn this into an expression. And again, we don't need to here. Oh, we don't want this field. So let's Control A and delete that. We're going to have to make that an expression again. But we want the trigger variable that was called, I believe it was called image. So we've used prompt, rate, voice encoding, and so we've got image and email to go. So let's come down here. So we're going to use image here. So the prompt here, we're going to make this an expression. And here we're going to use image, which is the image parameter from the webhook. And then finally, we want to email ourselves the results. And so let's use the Gmail send email block. So we'll name it Gmail. Hopefully, did we name this one? Nope. We should probably, we'll just call it image for now. So let's start thinking about what we need to do here. So in the configuration here, we're going to start with connecting it to our connector, and hopefully we did that with the image block as well. We've connected it to OpenAI, which is correct. This one's going to use our Gmail connector. Our from name is going to be Peter. Well, I'm going to send it to peter@fusing.com. My subject will be here is your story. And then the text is going to be the text from the original ChatGPT message. So it's going to be this again. So we'll put the text in here. So we do need this to be an expression. And again, we're going to be putting in the chat completion text in here. Now, remember we did the attachments here, so we can basically do the same thing here. So we want the image and so we've got two variables here. This is just JSON. It doesn't look like it right now, but audio.mp3. And remember, we dumped that into the file system at TMP audio MP3. So it's this file here. So files do need to live in the TMP folder. So that's our file that we generated from the Google text-to-speech. So our audio is going to be in that file, and then our artwork.jpg, or we'll call it image.jpg, is going to come from the URL from this block here. So let's go ahead and save our progress so far, and let's run this whole thing down to this block here so that we can get the some results into this block, so that then we can just take the URL. We don't need to key a whole lot of stuff in. So let's run from the start to here. And once this comes back, it'll take a little while because it's got to generate a story and an image. And then once this comes back, we should see, hopefully, if I've done everything correctly, which I did, it appears, then our data is in here. It's in the returns, and this is the URL we want. And we want this URL to go into here. And now, if I was to run this, and by the way, this needs to now be changed into what's called interpolation syntax, because we do need to. So we can do that by just putting a bracket on the start. That's all an expression field is. It's a field that starts with an expression. It starts with a bracket. And then this is a standard JavaScript construct, which is essentially a JSON object, but we're injecting the actual URL from the previous step into here. Now, if we were to run this, then we should get an email with the correct stuff in it. So let me go ahead and let's run this from top to bottom. So we'll run all blocks. And just remember, we're only using the test data from our event at the top, so nothing's going to change yet. But if this works, we're going to save it out and we're going to deploy it. And then we're going to start, I'll show you how we can essentially play with the blocks and play with those variables by using curl. So just stand by, and we'll check our email and we'll deploy it. Okay. Yeah, greetings back again, and it looks like our test worked, and I've deployed the workflow and waited a couple of minutes. So as not to take up any of your time, we are ready to go. So this workflow returned a short story, 50 words, about an octopus, and generated the audio as well. And so now I'm going to show you how we can parameterize this workflow using curl to set the various variables that we set up in our workflow. So before we do that, let's drag this off the screen and go back up to the top of our workflow. And remember, the variables that we created were prompt, rate, voice, encoding, image, and email. And you'll notice I'm using curl. This is just a bash shell script using curl to post this is the data I'm posting as JSON, and this is the endpoint for our workflow. So this was the webhook address, and this time I'm going to tell it to create a 100-word children's short story about a puppy explorer named Jim. We're going to slow down the rate, and we've got a voice. It's not a great voice, it's a male's voice. And it'll give you an idea, though. There are better voices out there, so you're going to get a better product by just exploring the different voices. So if we run this, so if we just test webhook, and while it's running, I will flip on over here and make sure that our email is cleared. So while this webhook is running, should take about 20 or 30 seconds or so to finish, And okay, that's finished now. So that was reasonably quick. So I'll drag this just down here, and here's our story just come in. And now we've got an Explorer puppy, and we've got our image, and we've got our audio.
Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a curious puppy named Jim.
So you can tell I've slowed down that voice, so we may want to increase the speed. But again, we can play to our heart's content. We can change the image, we can change the prompt, the rate, and with this, and we could email ourselves and then email it to the customer or directly to the customer. We could send them this story. So there you have it, a more advanced version of a workflow. And again, from the top, we use a webhook, and we've modeled the body and what it's going to look like in a test event. And we've used that. We explored using the Node.js AnyCode block. We were able to have a look at the context and the shape of that. We then passed on that data to ChatGPT to generate our text, our story, which we then passed along to Google Text-to-Speech. And then that in turn went, all that data got passed down to this block. We just used a couple of things to create our image, and then we bundled everything up in our Gmail block using expressions to send everything as a bundle to ourselves. So that's a more advanced block showing how you could develop a children's storyteller app. Hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you and have a great day.